For today's video, we're going to be turning to one of the most polarizing debates when it comes to the horror genre, and that is how much combat should there be, and the great discussion about whether to fight or not to have combat in a game. When it comes to the horror genre, there's always been this great big debate about the amount of combat that should be in any title. Going as far back as when we got survival horror with Alone in the Dark, you could famously sidekick enemies or zombies, which was very effective. But as the years went on, we saw combat become more and more of the core gameplay of the horror genre, and this came to a head with, of course, Resident Evil 4 and the branding of action horror, where instead of it being more of a combination of adventure and action gameplay, the adventure elements kind of took a complete backseat to the action. And what ended up happening was that despite the quality of these games, they became very repetitive and they lost all semblance of horror the further you played into them. With Resident Evil 4, it's very hard to be afraid when you have multiple shotguns, machine guns, snipers, grenades, and all the healing you can fit into Leon's magic briefcase. And then Dead Space, despite having some really great body horror enemies, again, it's hard to feel afraid when you have a railgun, grenade launcher, rocket launcher, stake gun, electric gun, flamethrower, and I think there are a few other ones I'm missing. And as the horror genre kind of had its big decline at the end of the last decade, developers are doing everything they could to keep shoehorning combat in. The game you're seeing up there is, of course, Rule of Rose, which is not a great horror game. It has an amazing setting, but the gameplay just doesn't work, and our main protagonist, Jennifer, there, is perhaps the wimpiest horror protagonist, I think, of all time. As you can see her, right now she's trying to stab those enemies with a fork, and not doing all that well. And it was reasons like this, in terms of just how much combat became a heavy part of the design, that led to developers moving away from it. Haunting Ground and Clock Tower both removed or downplayed the use of combat. And of course, one of the major examples was Frictional Games with Amnesia. Their previous franchise, Penumbra, had a focus on combat on top of its puzzle and adventure gameplay. And there have been interviews with the lead designer of it, and he talked about their decision to remove combat, as he felt that it took away from the sense of horror. And that has always been one of the major points that people point out about a lot of the horror games in the independent space. Five Nights at Freddy's, Outlast, the Slender Man games, and again, many, many more. That if we gave the player the ability to defend themselves or fight back, then the game wouldn't be scary. And this led to this whole idea, as we said in a previous video, of kind of like a set piece and audience focus when it comes to horror. That you're not really caring about, or you're not really interested in the gameplay. It's more about watching somebody else play and react and scream. I know everyone watching wants to make some YouTuber faces right now. And this is pretty much how horror kind of developed in the last decade, especially among the independent space. The one major exception for the longest time was Alien Isolation, and that game gave us combat without making it too powerful, and we'll talk more about that in the next section. But again, when it comes to how polarizing combat is, that if you go too far into it, then we run into the action horror stereotype. Again, if you're fighting 30, 40 enemies in the course of 4 or 5 hours of gameplay, you tend to lose that horror. This is the same problem that Resident Evil 2, and by some extension Resident Evil 7, ran into. That even though these enemies were scary and there was limited ammo, you were still very much in control in almost every combat encounter, with exceptions to Mr. X and the boss fights in Resident Evil 7. But when we have the independent space when it comes to horror, the problem is that they don't replace the combat. And I think that's where this issue comes into play for me. When I played Outlast and Five Nights and so on, there is no direct combat, but there's nothing else there as well. And that really was seen with Amnesia: Machine for Pigs, a game that will probably show up in the second half, and just how little was going on. And for a lot of these horror games, there's just no real content to this gameplay. Layers of Fear, for instance, as a series, has some amazing set pieces and a beautiful engine, but there's nothing else really going on. Yes, we have puzzle solving, but that's been in horror games since Alone in the Dark. And so many of these horror games, or quote-unquote horror games that have been released, don't really have the content to sustain itself. With Outlast, I've gotten more bored and frustrated at that game than I was scared. Five Nights at Freddy's, I started to doze off while playing that game. And again, when you're trying to instill horror in the player, you have to give them some kind of connection to this world. Not just hiding behind a box, or slowly creeping around when you can barely see. One of the games that did really well in this regard, at least came somewhat close, was Fatal Frame 3 that we ran on stream. The reason is that while there is combat to the game, it is very much downplayed compared to other horror games, even Silent Hill. You're fighting maybe like 10 enemies at most per chapter, and that's on the extreme side. And it's mostly, I think there's only like a few scenarios where it's more than one enemy. Combat is very slow, it's very methodical, and I think it sticks out more in your mind compared to something like Dead Space or Resident Evil, where every room you're fighting 2 to 3 enemies. Dead Space routinely locks a player in an arena fight and then just says, here's 20 enemies, kill them all. And this has always been that difference between horror and kind of horror adjacent, and then action horror as well. And again, you can't just say your game is horror because you have monsters, or you're in a spooky house. And this is why it's so difficult to do horror right, because there's so much that goes into it. But with that said, we're going to do our Patreon supporter and sponsor shout out now, and when we come back, we're going to talk about how games can try and have their cake and eat it too, with having combat, but not having it overstay its welcome. And now for a quick thank you to our current Game Wisdom sponsors and Patreon supporters. And if you'd like to continue the discussion on game design, be sure to check out our Discord channel, linked down below. Here we have some lovely footage of Amnesia, A Machine for Pigs, and probably one of the worst horror games I think released this decade. And the reason is very simple. There's no real gameplay loop to this. Yes, you solve puzzles occasionally and you walk around, well, probably a very large estate, but there's just very little interaction by the player. And again, this is why many games had combat, because combat is one of the easiest systems to give the player agency. A sword, gun, dodge rolling, you name it. And the balance between combat or power and powerless in a horror game is very hard to do right, and goes back to that discussion about horror versus horror adjacent and then to action horror. The more power you give the player, the less horror there's going to be. And if you go too little in terms of power, then they lose all agency in the world. Why should I care about my character if the second I get spotted I die and there's nothing else to it? And the strangest thing about this is that I can't think of any example of a game that 100% gets all points about horror and combat right. For instance, I love in Resident Evil 2 how dynamic the enemies or the zombies are in that game and how they can track the player. Their movement is kind of emergent based on where you do damage to them, and they're probably the most dangerous zombies I think in any of the Resident Evil games. However, you have that situation where by the halfway point, you're completely decked out. Once you get the shotgun in Resident Evil, pretty much almost all bets are off. And many people who have speedran Resident Evil 2 know that despite how dangerous those zombies are, they are still very easily manipulated. Going back to Alien Isolation, the idea of having the alpha antagonist with the xenomorph is a great touch, but it still has that element of a lack of control. Once the alien spots you, especially on the highest difficulty, you're done. rinse and repeat. And it's very hard to get these systems to work properly. Now, with that discussion about the idea of horror adjacent, we have games such as that Betrayer title we looked at on stream, Control, and other examples. So here's a really good point right here on screen. There's a lovely little shotgun here, but it is completely inaccessible to us in a horror game. But getting back to Control, despite the amazing environment and lore of that game, and the fact that you are fighting possessed former employees of the FBC, it's not really horror because you have too much, I guess no pun intended, control over the situation. Why should I be afraid of giant elder gods and aliens and whatever the heck else is in that world if I can just pick up stuff and throw it using my mind, and that's the best weapon in the game? And the balance, again, it's not something that's going to be easily answered. I felt Resident Evil 2 had Resident Evil 7 had some really great ideas with the Baker family, but the second half of the game loses or squanders that horror when you are just completely decked out, and anyone remembers the cruise ship and how annoying that section was. In order to make combat work, and here's where we get to our little safely extreme example, it needs to be interesting, it needs to be challenging, but at the same time, it can't become routine. And very few games have managed to do that. Fatal Frame, again, comes close, but the problem is that the enemies themselves are not dynamic enough. That each enemy has a very set pattern in terms of how they play out. And once you know that, it doesn't matter how spooky they are or the fact that they can walk through walls and floors, you can deal with them. And you have stuff like Dead Rising as another example. That Dead Rising is horror adjacent. I wouldn't put it as action horror because you're not really, the combat system I don't think is strong enough for it. You're essentially in a zombie apocalypse, but instead of being scared, you're crafting lightsabers and flamethrower water soakers and so on and so on. And it reminds me again of Left 4 Dead. That Left 4 Dead had a huge change in terms of its tone and shift between the first and second games, going from more of a horror to more of like the action movie horror. And I'm really surprised that we haven't seen developers try and emulate or iterate on the Left 4 Dead model and making it more horror-based. Because I am one of those people who think that you can do horror with multiplayer. It hasn't been, I think, fully done yet or done well, but I think that could happen. And that's a topic for another time. To begin to wrap things up, combat, I believe, is a necessary part of the horror genre. Again, going back to fight or flight. And if you remove it, you either have to really play up something else, or you have to get inventive with your design. Because just having the player wander around and get scared by spooky noises or tapping at the glass does not make a good horror experience. And even though that may sound like just give every character guns, make explosions and all that, that also doesn't create horror as well, because there's only so much you can do to the player in terms of combat before it just completely overtakes the experience. Like, even with titles like The Evil Within, Alan Wake, and other ones I'm drawing a blank on right now, you have the player fighting these monsters and even having to force to run or hide. But combat is still so powerful that it renders any kind of horror moot. Like, my question for you watching this right now, would you consider a game like Alan Wake a horror game? Or would it be more of an action game with horror elements? I really enjoyed something like Betrayer that helped the combat kind of measured by the fact that we're dealing with 18th century weapons, so everything takes forever to load. But you're still the most powerful character on the field. At one point during a play, I did a complete free aim grenade throw onto a group of enemies, killing them all in a single blast. When you say that about your game, that immediately nulls and voids any attempt at it being horror. My final question for you watching this: how would you design a combat system for a horror game? Again, making it powerful enough that the player has agency, but not so powerful that it becomes the de facto best example or best option in every scenario. Even stealth games have struggled with this as well, but that's a topic for another time. And I've had some examples that I've been thinking about in terms of combining combat in a horror game while making it more dynamic, but without giving the player complete power. But that is another topic for another time. So thank you so much for watching this video. Be sure to come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we study the art and science of games. Until next time, take care. If you're looking for more wisdom about game design, be sure to check out my latest offering of books, 20 Essential Games to Study, aimed for first-time developers and students looking for some inspiration for their upcoming games, and Game Design Deep Dive Platformers if you're interested in anything regarding 2D and 3D platforming design. They're both available in print, digital, and wherever books are being sold. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel linked down below where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.